And now it's my pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker, who is the Chinese composer, performer, professor, artistic director, musical activist based in New York, Du Yun. You're about to see a pre-recorded keynote speech, and afterwards Du Yun will be with us live for a Q&A. And thanks a lot to Du Yun in New York for staying up all night to be with us here in this early start of the New York day. Du Yun has been artistic director of the MATA Festival in New York. She also initiated the Pan Asia Sounding Festival. And as a composer and performer, she has stated that her work starts from what is a lack of understanding and empathy around immigration. Her some key works over the last years has been the opera Angel's Bone, around focusing on human trafficking, which in 2017 won the Pulitzer Prize. She made the big work Where We Lost Our Shadows in 2019 with the filmmaker Khaled Jarrah and the soloist Pakistani raga singer Ali Sethi, following a family of refugees up through Europe in film and music. In March this year, she just got around to premiering the big collaborative project Sweetland in Los Angeles, an outdoor project, which was a grotesque historical pageant and a project that disrupted the dominant narrative of American identity. The project itself was unfortunately also disrupted, had to close down due to the pandemic, but it can be seen also now online. The Carnegie Foundation has labeled her one of 38 great American immigrants, and today we're very happy to now follow Du Yun's keynote speech, multifaceted curating. Thank you very much. The floor is Du Yun's.
When we are talking about culture, I always think about whose culture are we talking about, and what part of the history are we really thinking that is the part of the history we're talking about. And I want our audience to experience, not to say, okay, that happened to them, not me.
The year was, and it is 2020, the year of the existential crisis. Many of us have been brewing doubts about who we are and where we belong. Culture becomes a privilege, a mirror of values, a nexus of self and a socio-economic realization. In this time of rampant nationalism and cancel culture, current social structures highlight the divides between us all. A global pandemic, to many of us, only heighten these walls. Today, we need to rethink our gateways, our entry points to the world. Throughout this dialogue, I want to share with you more highlights from recent conversations. Each of these artists engage with the multiplicities of who they are in ways that are poignant. They lead by example in their respective communities, and their creative efforts are vital steps towards a more sustainable process.
Complex question, as I'm now familiar with your standpoint and the same kind of ethos I believe that we share with this idea of tradition, and also how to reflect it with the Eurocentric audiences, or this term world or global music or whatever it may be, and how we get put into that. It's touch and go for me. There's lots of things I love about the idea of tradition. There's lots of things that I really just struggle with. And I think that's a product of being a child of immigrants and born and raised in America, losing some of the language, you know, in that process of not being fluent in Hindi or Punjabi, but then finding music as my source of this universal language that connects back to my people. It connects to really anyone and everyone, you know.
And your parents are from the Jainism, right? You talked about a bit.
Yeah, we also have that aspect as well. You know, aside from the immigrant thing, we're also Jains, and we're Punjabi Jains, it's very much an anomaly. When even when I meet South Asian folks here and I say I'm Jain, they presume that I'm from Gujarat or Rajasthan.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some portion of the people think I'm from South India. But there was a small enclave of Jains that migrated to Punjab in like 13th century after some invasions. I mean, this is information I found just cobbling together different resources and talking to my father about understanding our original Gotra, which is our original last name, and where we come from. But, you know, a lot of Jains migrated to Punjab and Western Punjab, specifically in Sialkot, which then was separated from partition independence of the subcontinent. And over kind of religious lines, a lot of Western folks went east and Eastern went west. And so my parents were part of that as well. But so, yeah, that definitely plays into the idea of traditions. I mean, growing up, you get inside of what the motifs are, or what the motives are, and the intention is. When you're dealing with folks really outside of South Asia, you're largely kind of having to generalize things, you know? And yeah, I think that's where it goes back and forth with this idea of the noun and the verb and how are we utilizing this, you know? And I guess I say that just from the aspect of seeing how the history of jazz has evolved, you know, something that's very, very young, really, in its art form, but how much it's developed and how much it's become a vocabulary and a mainstay within American music. You know, it's really one of the very few American art forms, you know, that this country can claim. And there's a lot of dissection and vocabulary and involvement and history with that you can delve into. So I would imagine on the realm of, you know, talking about, you know, and I use South Asian. I primarily like using South Asian because it eradicates, or Hindustan, you know, because it eradicates the idea of colonialism and what it did to Pakistan, what it did to India, Bangladesh. While I respect and understand that those are separate countries, for my lineage, you know, my parents come from India, they come from Pakistan, they are Jains, they're Punjabi, they're everything. So for me, in this culture of America, when I say South Asia, to me it kind of represents all the people that come from that subcontinent, you know, from the folks I meet here in this country, versus having more separation, you know, but still acknowledging and you know, with there being more representation from all corners of the globe, in people being able to delve into the nuances and being able to talk about it to audiences and talk about it to anyone that's listening. I think people are going to gain more knowledge. People are going to gain more vocabulary and ability to wrap their head around what it is. You know, I can certainly say that's true with Jainism. You know, just growing up, no one knew what that religion was. You know, until maybe I was 18, until I went to college. It's never a static thing. You know, and I think that relates to the idea of what you just said again, you know, the idea of tradition and building that vocabulary. Like nothing is ever static. I think
I admire Sunny's fearlessness. He is also fortunate. He has access to knowledge and therefore choice. In order to be fearless, you have to first know and have access to traditions being taught. Traditions cannot be on an altar, like it's been lost. You cannot tell someone they're a child of that land and not giving them access to knowledge of it. If they could easily travel outside, they would. But sometimes they cannot. We need to redistribute the wealth of resources of knowledge. With this, we create choices of who gets to reinvent for themselves and has the power to say so. Often, knowledge is not publicly available. We must examine how knowledges are sourced and categorized. Only then can we widen the scope of who gets to create what. In risking our sense of self, we must also re-evaluate what it means to succeed. So much funding goes to fetishizing world premieres. What does that even mean? What's the lifespan of this work? Can we reimagine world premieres as the start of new conversations to be had? Remembering art is something that keeps building, not a finished relic. Unlike culture, a world premiere is not mutable. Stop competing with numbers of world premieres. Stop competing with numbers of regions you claim to represent. Stop comparing where you excel in relation to someone else's. This is not a project of now. We will not see immediate change. But with time, patience, and care, however, our future generations might see the heart of our labors.
I have been following this initiative, and you've been doing this for quite a number of years, right?
40 years.
40 years.
It started first 40 years ago. We call it Khmer Study Institute. And after some years or so, it was dissolved. And later on, I returned back to start the new initiative with my wife, Susan. So it is called Nirmata Composers Institute.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah.
And this is in Siem Reap?
No, it's wherever.
Wherever, yes. Exactly.
Wherever, especially nowadays. It include one contemporary dance by a young man. He's an emerging choreographer and also dancer. He has been observing the workshop the past few days, and then another dance piece is for a young lady. The choreographer, I assume that's her teacher. Her teacher, Sam Satya, and that's belonged to the first workshop that has something to do with, I call it new traditional music composition. And so if you imagine the center, when the pebble, the classic pebble being launched on the lake, and so that is the core of the whatever remaining of the tradition, and in this case it's music. And so the first workshop really designed to not, this is what I explained to the student, is it just like after you get married and you prefer to stay maybe just 10 kilometers or 10 kilometers from your village. You don't want to go like 1,000 kilometers and so forth. And it's their choices. They have leverage. Right. You know, they have leverage. But here I call it global contemporary music composition. It's a workshop too. This one, unlike the first one, it's more it's center it's center on the folk culture. So the musician are folk musician, and that one is really interesting. We see the field of music composition as a missing link. If we compare to other fields in the performing arts, for example, theater, even cinema, circus, dance drama and all that, they have been flourishing, yes. Creating new art forms. And the music, almost zero. Okay, for example, one of my competitors argued that the reason we the reason that they're not composing new work because the genocide. I said, that's not true. When I was there before the genocide, you guys didn't compose anything. And then someone argue in a different take, saying that when he performed in a traditional music, he is actually composing. I said, no, you are elaborating. Okay, you are being creative, but you are elaborating. The structure of a Roger board is still the same. When I see that, my wife and I decided that we should do something about that, and that's why we create Nimitta Composer Institute. Mainly, a couple of things here. Mainly, we train the next generation of composer in both discipline. One is in Western type of tendency, like string quartet or whatever. And this summer we decided to sort of center on the training on their own tradition. Okay, such as the court music. That's the first workshop for dance, and then the second one is the folk music. Yeah. Another thing that I should say that in general we have been welcoming young composers from, let's say, from Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, the Philippines, including, but each time there always a few Cambodian kids sort of mingle with that. The reason that I want to start it simultaneously this way is to introduce them to the region of Southeast Asia at large. And sometimes they're like 3 composers put it together, literally, because they want to draft out a large-scale form, like over 10 minutes and so forth. You know, we are talking about 101 student here. We're not talking about advanced student at all. Right. You know, and they figure out a way. Yeah.
And my other question is, how do you think about the relationship between the tradition and the classical music, whatever that the classical means, or contemporary music?
Right. That's a big topic, and yes, you can always find a relationship. You can always find, and the question is how far one wants to go. How much distant from your parents' village to your village or your future's village. Okay, this is really up to them. We are only listener. We are only trying to help them and try to guide them. We don't play the role as teachers. We don't believe in that. We just guide them. And so
guide them in what way?
Guide them by reading their mind, by reading their manifestation sonically, by sensing something that come out from the earth, and something that could be parallel to the tradition, but of a different tone, different language, and something is pure imagination. There's so many things there. So another word, is better not to have a set of rule, a tool to put it on the table. Okay, I have to mingle it with finesse, with understanding, sensing, more patient, and so forth. Yeah, and they are some of them are really fast. They're really fast. They can shift the same piece with different angle each day, different angle, and then we just ask the question and say, right now, the way you play Jacquet and the conversation with the boss and yourself or the young man in the factory and all that, you have three to bother with. But you know, we haven't heard much of the Jacquet play. That one need to have a role, you know. Then he come back with it. I think it's really interesting.
So you encourage more of that experimentation.
Yeah, to see what the one thing that anywhere I believe that we cannot we can talk about the dose, the what's missing, what is so much and so forth, but we cannot draw a line and say, hey, you know, this is such a degree and so forth, and you should exercise. Okay, I think that's why I use the term to guide instead of to teach. To teach is mean you teaching perhaps model, or you by a school of thought, or you're teaching your own school of thought. And I think, to me, in a way, it is a cultural suicidal. You don't give the freedom of the artist to, and you don't work hard enough to read their mind, read their heart, and know where they are, where they're coming from, and so forth. You see, and that is, to me, is essential in such in a way when you are dealing with the genocide that cost millions of lives and so forth, and after that they haven't fully recovered in the psychological way, you know, their mental state and so forth, and you have to take all of these things into consideration. Yeah.
That was so beautifully put, especially the cultural suicide. I'm having goosebumps just hearing that. And have you encountered the resistance when you are guiding those?
Yeah. During some in the region up north, there was some resistance. Okay, there was a clear split between traditionalists and the explorer. Okay, and so that's really hard for me. Simply, it go against a given situation that we work together and so forth as collaborators, and you know. But I was pretty patient. I had to figure out a way to bounce back by giving the same exercise to everyone the next morning and see what they come up with. And they came up with 0. And so it means like they had to follow me now. One-man show. I think, and he does not realize that he's already overlapped and even almost heavily like a Western composer already. He has no clue whatsoever, except we who had training from the West know it. And he never heard this thing at all. Now, how can a remote performing artist find the common ground with the West without the knowledge, without training, and so forth? And I think this might be an interesting idea to further observe, and that they just had to grab on any piece of wood when you are in the river, you know, and it is understandable. But this has been going for too long. And we all know, that's how I keep telling some of my artist friends, I said that you and sister compose all the time, create a new art form all the time, okay? And without that, you don't have a sonic interpretation of what a given culture is all about. Okay, when you don't have that, a kind of abstract type of artistic manifestation in a given culture, then the preservation will sink at some point, because how long can a culture preserve a 2,000-year-old piece, a 3,000-year-old piece? No, there is no way. It's going to go down by itself, one by one. That's why the new offshoot from the main central tradition, whatever it might be, need to move on, need to create more pieces.
We need to invest in new ideas in a way that frees them from a limiting system. This is what I look at as a sustainable way of new diversity. Instead of commissioning a work or an artist, what if we invest funding resources for collective idea brewing? Rather than a world premiere or finished project, we accept that a new idea is the result, one that will continue to adapt and evolve over time, a living, breathing idea. At the heart of this collective idea brewing, we need a training ground driven by Skillshare. It is important to bring together artists and collectives with a production team. Provide production and design knowledge to regions without existing equipment and frameworks, so that specific and local knowledge merges with knowledge for the production. For example, setting up workshops in the field of lighting design or workshopping applications for project funding. Critical to this Skillshare is the inclusion of a translator from the beginning. Ensuring information is available feeds the new idea back into the community. And let's not forget about our audience. They are just as important in the dialogue surrounding new ideas. Right now, education is separate for presenters and sometimes an afterthought. Inclusive audience education takes into account the fundamentals and offer impossible knowledge of traditions while still allowing a certain freedom to incubate new ideas in consideration of history, the human condition, and our lived reality. World music is a coined term by the West, a Eurocentric approach that implies a high and a low culture. Festivals and concerts talk little about its classical approaches, lineages, and nuance. We need more of a guided listening process, asking what are the history of the instruments, how are they used in this context. We need to acknowledge its own classical approach and its own experimentational mutations. Always family concerts and late or early night, not prime time, they feel like they are being represented but becomes only a feel-good experience. It's not that people don't know how to learn, it's about how to set up a conversation.
It's really kind of opening up those pathways.
Right.
That's how it happens. You know, I don't think from the individual, I think it's about solidarity anyway. It's great that we're chatting, you know.
Absolutely.
This is really important, is how collectively we can, you know, shift things. Is that nothing changes unless you change the narrative, you know, the kind of underlying story. Because I think stories are so powerful. The story you tell creates your world, right?
Right.
and allows you to see and think and imagine, you know, certain conditions and possibilities. And so one thing I really see, because there are plenty of, you know, sort of schemes, you know, that you know, are set up to help people of color or women composers or, you know, whatever kind of so-called marginal group there might be. You know, part of it is actually just having enough time, you know, because you can't know everything straight away.
Right.
Because people don't trust you
Exactly.
unless you have that relationship, right? You can't just sort of go in there and expect to sort of know stuff and learn stuff. I mean, that's a very sort of Western academic approach, right? That you go and study something, you know, and that it's there for you to study. Whereas from inside the culture, no, it's not
Right.
Really like that. You know, you have responsibilities.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have responsibilities.
You have to learn how to breathe for 3 months before you can pick up something. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And so I feel time is really crucial. And that's why, you know, it's so tricky because there's no quick fix.
Right. Absolutely.
And so I think what we see is that it requires like really long investment to get significant change. And sorry, I just can't see any sort of really fast fix. But on the other hand, yeah, this notion of leadership coming from within other communities is for me the only sort of really healthy way to do it, and investing in that, you know, actually modeling the pathways in which you're kind of building something culturally, you know, in a really deep, long-term sense. You know, this curatorial role for me is identifying what I see as the strength of the artist and really, you know, trying to encourage that through and providing the resources, right? You know, you need someone to help you transcribe, you know, that all the stuff that the visual artists have, yeah? You know, artists don't build their own stuff. Other people help, you know, build it, source materials, solve the technical problems. And I think this kind of approach is what's needed. If you want to engage artists who haven't had those privileged pathways where they've already learned blah, blah, blah.
And I think that in music, this is actually what we should actually champion is instead of saying that, you know, artist director needs to do all that, right? But actually say we need to set up a roster of mentorship that can address all those, you know, and we actually have the funding to give the mentorship, right? So it's a very like, you know, healthy mentorship program, or we maybe don't say that word as mentorship, but collaborator, that kind of, you know, ideas that how, or just, you need someone to be inside of that cultural dialogue. And then you also need, you know, a pathway to open up that, right? Because this is what your role is with the festivals you're engaging, or the performance that you're engaging.
I think that's important, modeling of the pathway, you know, because if you've really grown up in a privileged way where you had your music lessons and you did all the theory and all the exam, you know, all those sort of grades that, you know, kids from middle class families do. And then after that, you go to the summer camp, and then from there you pick up, you know, mentorship. So, you know, all of that's already a pathway. So you have to model that kind of thing for people who haven't had the money. Right? It's not like the path. It's not like the model doesn't exist. It does exist. It's the model. That's how, you know, people from privileged families get into conservatoria and, you know, progress and whatever. So it's finding, like, recognizing that, and not expecting someone who doesn't have the background just to go straight in and be able to succeed. That, you know, that's a failure, and then their fault. Again, it's like the person is the problem, it's their fault. So, it's just kind of accepting that, that you actually have to build the invisible model, you know, that is operating to support these other people if you really want them in that space. You know, you can't just say, okay, here's this person who's never in orchestral work. I'm gonna change my programming by commissioning them. That's not going to work. They absolutely need that mentoring and the modeling and all that support to make it happen.
I think later.
Not
translator is the metaphorically translator.
Right. And you need the intermediate step so that, you know, you work with a smaller group first. You know, you have the workshop kind of process. But you know, this is not, again, I have to say, turn it around. So that's not the problem. That becomes the richness of seeing this, you know, that if there's a person who's never been represented in that area suddenly is there How can their community celebrate them? You know, how do you turn that? For me, that kind of teaching method is the way it works in Indigenous communities. You make people feel something and then they understand, instead of this intellectual route where you explain something and
I'm having goosebumps.
Yeah, you have to have to integrate it and then you perform something. It's the other way around. It's like immediately gut reaction. You feel something and then it's
and you can empathy. You know, you can empathy. Oh, you are all of a sudden could be that, because when you are removed, you don't feel. You know, you think it's always.
But for me, that's what it is. It is this basic shift. It's not an intellectual thing. It's like knowing from the inside. It's knowing through experience, you know, what the life is of other people, and just how powerful that can be. Thinking about is, you know, how to stretch out, you know, open up and stretch out the process and make that more available. And by doing that, that invites, you know, different kinds of people in. They can inhabit this more stretched out space.
Exactly.
Whereas
Thinking about a better digital future can only be informed by our learnings from the past and made even stronger with tools of today and tomorrow. Music is a byproduct of the land, the dialect, and the landscape. If you take the landscape out, the distance, the weather, the food, it's dry, it's like a vacuum. With this in mind, we can then understand the instruments and voices as stories of human migration. Can we imagine a web resource to trace these stories and ground them? One that fully explores these practices as their heritages as well as their evolution. Because of COVID, this is a great time to rethink how users explore knowledge on the internet. How can we deepen conversations with a wider reach, from Berlin to the artists in the places where these instruments and voices practices are from or have passed through? Again, to do this, we must examine how knowledges are sourced and categorized, how this determines who has access to this knowledge. Through this, we can secure the future of disappearing oral traditions and activate the current stories.
That facilitators, let's say curators or programmers or other artists, should make the space for an artist to be able to transform, to change. On the other hand, I might have a different identity as a teacher or as a mentor to other Native students, or for yourself with, you know, let's say Chinese American students who are, you know, trying to find their place in the world, or you know, immigrant students, is that I think they do need some handles to say, oh, this is a person who's come before me who understood how to navigate this. In those situations, I give more away, or I'm more open about maybe where I'm coming from or who I think I am, and so that's important too, because I can't be that same person to people who are trying to learn. And what the project is myself going to different reservation schools, the Navajo Reservation, where I'm from, also the Hopi Reservation, which is also in northern Arizona, and previously also we were working with the Salt River Pima community, which is near Phoenix. And I go to a high school for a week and recruit some young composers, maybe up to 10 at each school, and give them the assignment of writing a 3-minute piece for string quartet. And so half of these schools, they have music programs. And the reason they have music programs is usually because they have a really good football team or sports team. So they need a marching band.
Right.
And other schools, they don't have any arts funding. They don't have any, you know, they just have very few classes. And some of these schools are very rural. Some of the students don't have electricity in their homes or running water. So you have a full, you know, different spectrum of conditions of where these students are coming from. And so, you know, giving them the task of writing in Western notation, for me, I approach it like they're learning another language that they're going to have to relay on to a group of professional musicians who only read that language or who are most versed in that language.
One thing that's evolved out of this program is a very wide interpretation of vibrato. So I think that's a cultural thing that has come out in which the students are trying to replicate the voice. So I let them know that the string players are going to automatically add vibrato into the work, but that a lot of times we have a student say, well, I wanted a very wide vibrato or a very slow vibrato or a very fast vibrato. So a lot of times we have students really use that technique to get across a certain sound that they want, almost like like you would hear in a voice or a Navajo singing or Hopi singing, where you have this this vibrato that might begin one way and end in another way.
That's the biggest thing I can teach these students is that, it's a language. You can learn this language. You can understand these instruments, which are beautiful instruments. They have their own tradition, but it doesn't mean you have to write in that way, And there are going to be different corners of this world that won't like what you do, but there will be very strange corners that might like what the odd things you make with these tools in this language. So that's all I can really teach these young people. And, what's been interesting is, in the 21st century is that all these young people might have, apps and iPhones and things. And maybe they're not interested in writing another string quartet again, but I get students who then, have questions of, oh, well, I want to work in a recording studio, or I want to move to the next city and, make other kinds of music. And so that's where, a lot of the lessons end up, evolving into something else, or they want to become a sculptor or, a filmmaker. And so, I'm there to also at least try to guide some of that discussion. But yeah, it's to let them know that, on one hand, we're dealing with a very old European tradition. On the other hand, that's just one way to get into some kind of door that goes somewhere else. I think first, one should research that person's work, and it's not a big problem right now, but find out, of course, what tribe this person is from, where they come from. Seek out folks that are, identifying as indigenous, are recognized in their communities as being indigenous artists, and you must like their work. I mean, don't collaborate with somebody and you don't really like their work. And then just now we can, Zoom each other up, it seems like, and take the discussion further. But of course, they should be equal collaborations. If you're seeking a film score or something and you need a very particular flute and drum kind of thing, yeah, sure, that's some other kind of paid gig. But if you're talking about an art collaboration, I think should be a very equitable situation and a very self-determined situation between those involved about what it's going to be. And you might find that the person has an idea that they would like to that might need that contribution from the person who's seeking the collaboration that they don't have access to. So that can be very equitable and kind of reciprocal relationship of making something that would never exist in the world had that union not come together. Other than that, yeah, there's no excuse for not really researching somebody's work right now. I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that not just making a concert of identity. I think there's other things to talk about than somebody's identity. There could be shared experiences. There could be shared ancestral experiences. There could be, worldview. I think there's a lot of overlap in worldview, cultural worldview or contemporary worldview. And I think it definitely requires some meetings with somebody, time permitting, just to see, what do you think of this? What do you think? And being very open-minded if somebody might have issue with, let's say, a title or something. There's a lot of tropes. I mean, nobody should be making concerts that say decolonize this, or, that's overused right now. So decolonization, all these things, without really seeking what that might mean to somebody. But I think there's a lot of these kinds of tropes that are happening.
What that might mean to to you, decolonization?
I just feel like it's an overused kind of saying, you know, in exhibition titles, or there's been a couple concerts or conferences where it's,
Yes.
you know, it's talking about that, but there's so much more to talk about. I mean, there's so much more to go deeper into than just decolonizing the institution.
As Raven mentioned, dialogue with artists is key. In these same breaths, we often talk in terms of reconciliation. Like Tug and Young mentioned in their article, to reconcile is to rescue a settler's future. Asking what will decolonization look like? What are the consequences? We cannot continue to reconcile and center reconciliation within our dialogues. Rather, we must acknowledge that the expected results cannot be dictated within a singular framework. Unless we are fluid in our approach, we in fact keep these colonial structures we aim to dismantle. Dictating results is patriarchal in itself. We cannot always react to a situation. We must be proactive in ideating and accommodating fluidity. And during this process, accidents are okay. They will happen on this ongoing process. Someone's accident could just be a way of experimenting, while these accidents or unruliness could be someone else's survival skills, perhaps even their only modes of living. Those of us presenting the work of others must be nimble in a way that gives agency to artists. As such, it is imperative we invite this unknowing into process of creation. We are all aware of the cyclic process, but how do we reimagine a future always informed by the time you're given, by the evolving cultures that you are encountering and living in? We must reimagine this as a spiral, with a trajectory leaving the core, yet anchored with a continuous, thorough research. We must also remember that experimentation is contextual, and it is essential to think about this on a local scale. Oftentimes, when artists experiment, this is disruptive to their community's infrastructure. When you are being shunned by the old guard, and when man-made geographic borders are the limitations of your world. We must meet and listen to these people where and how they are. This is a two-way street. Only together can we reimagine models of collaboration, leaning on each other's knowledge and modes of existence. Only together can we learn how to reinform and co-inhabit in the post-COVID world. This takes time. Let's focus on the transformative years, letting go of the quantifiable results, because, as we know, results always change and shift faster than we can predict. Today, you have been invited into our dialogues. Let's not have this to be a project of now. Let's keep the momentum going. Off I go.
So thank you very much, Du Yun, for this most inspiring and collaborative keynote speech here of our seminar, Curating Diversity. And Du Yun, you are with us from New York?
I am. Hello. Oh my God, I see myself so big.
So we have around 13 minutes now for a short Q&A, and if you who are following us on Zoom or YouTube have any questions, please type them and they will get to me, and we can include those questions also in the next 13 minutes. But Du Yun, first of all, you know, when listening and watching this keynote, previously we have talked a lot about your idea of future tradition. And today, I think we have heard that future tradition for you is also very, very much linked to questions of engaging, of listening, and also in your dialogue with Lisa Lim and the very deep idea of finding a new pathway. But could you maybe talk a little bit more about what does future tradition mean to you and how do we get there?
In many senses, I think that we should also stop talking about the future because the present is the future. And then the pathway is the idea of mediating, and I think that Shinri Ong was also talking about that too, including Raven. That's why I engage all the artists to share those worldviews and practices. One thing is that, you know, I'm looking at the people who have engaged for many years and who have shared their own practice within their communities. So sometimes, and even like if you're from that community, because the community always changing and evolving and shifting with the time and world events, so that we do need that the linking person, and be it that person or be that agent. And sometimes it can be the artist, or sometimes it can be a local community person, or sometimes it needs to be a translator of dialects to dialects and to languages. Because I have been on panels looking at proposals, for instance, and then each organizations have their own way of, own idea of what proposals or what the work of music or art should look like or should feel like. And unfortunately, those kind of knowledge is not accessible to all of the people that you want to engage. So when we really wanted to dig deeper of the idea of diversity, we do need to think first is that the standard of what you think of that the clean packaged idea of what you wanted to address and what you think, and that's why I wanted to say that we need a translator in between these two directions too. So it's not just the artistic director or the curator thinking that now today, this year, in the next 3 years, we're going to address these problems. And then we are going to find all those people to address those problems for us. And therefore our audience will be the next level of appreciation, all that. I think that if we really care for that diversity, which means that we care for the people who are living on the land, on the diverse land, so that we need to look at, we need to address at the core of the urge why we wanted to know the other people.
Thanks a lot. And I think this touches very much upon the question of representation, but not only representation in terms of who's on stage, but also representation of who's actually involved, how they are involved, where they are represented. And you seem to also have expanded your role as an artist in the recent years, on the one hand as a composer and a performer, but I also somehow sense an expanding activist dimension in the way you work. How do you see this yourself?
I think I'm always activist. I think that, just increasingly, if you have more platform, you're going to speak louder and more frequently, and your voice is going to be heard more, and you wanted to engage other artists to speak with you. I think that's kind of also by invitations, right? So you're not just saying that these are the things that I think should work. Going back to what you were trying to say about representation, sometimes I think that when you do need to think about what the representation really means, what I mean by that is that sometimes from other side, perhaps there will be people thinking that, oh, this is what they wanted us to do. So this idea of the presentation of that work, or the presentation of that selection of the work could also be edited down. So I'm more interested in correlating these new ideas, because I'm more interested in, because inside they need like new ideas coming in, you know? It's never about, oh, you're introducing you to us. This is what I meant by stop talking about decolonization. It's really about interested in this, perhaps having this ideas to build, to rebuild, and how to rebuild a new allyship as well.
Thanks a lot. And we have a question here from YouTube from Yuingen Wang, who was asking, I would love an elaboration on what decolonization means to you and why it may not be enough. And maybe also something about on, you know, how decolonization differs from diversification.
The question is colonization, decolonization, and diversification, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Because in the article of the terms they were talking about is that it addresses the settlers' future. It does not addresses the people from within as much. So when you're talking about decolonizing, and when you're saying that decolonizing into the whole idea of the music, and you're positioning this Western or Anglo-American classical music practices as the superior status, which to many people they don't agree, which to many people they will argue your classical music is not my classical music. So, when we are talking, you know, when we are in those rooms and talking about the Contemporary Music Festival, we talk a lot about the experimentation, what that means in experimentation. I think that we really need to address whose contemporary life are we talking about? What kind of music and whose contemporary music are we addressing? And when we're listening to music, you know, we often say, oh, this is the world music and that's not experimentation enough. But we neglect, sometimes we do neglect that we don't have that the same set of training system to understand the nuances of that could be that experimentation. So we need that kind of also mediation coming in as well.
And we have one more question here online, and then I'd also like to ask if there are any questions in the live audience. So after the next question, which comes from online, if you have any questions where you are in Berlin, you can go to the microphone on stage. But first, from Peter Meanwell, he's asking if we can convince funders and organizations to give priority to this idea of pathway and process and mentorship, rather than giving priority to the idea of commissions or premiers. Can you then reflect on how we as a collective could shift the audience's expectations, not to be focusing on, you know, the genius and the canon and the novelty of the music, but more to something else, how we can work with this in relation to the audiences?
Absolutely. I've been thinking about this a lot too, and those discussion are very much at core of today's discussion. You know, in this cultural, societal time. First of all, let's just say the people who run the foundations and organizations are the same people as you and me. So we're just addressing those social issues. When we are having those social movements, all the people are standing up and rise to the occasion and wanted to have a discussion and want to relook at the framework and wanted to reshift that radical shift. So I actually believe and I really think that if we step away and have that, inviting those people come in too, and have that same round table, so let's looking at the reconstruct this, what that process mean, you know, what that workshop really holds. Is that workshop can be the preview of something? Is that preview can be that work? So for me, because when you think about it, like all, historically in many practices, music has always been a test ground for how the community really works, how the community really relate to each other. And I think that we can go back to that kind of, Autumn was saying, like the spiritual way of connecting, and really address that. This is how we connecting to each other, especially now that COVID has taught us is that we really need each other. That kind of loneliness is a privilege to have, right? So I think that we need a little bit of thinking together and thinking about how we can deconstruct the world premiere and the ending result. I think that's the ending result that I'm trying to shatter a little bit here. Because if you were to ask any composers, if you were to ask any performers, no one would tell you that the world premiere is actually only the beginning of the life of that work. So as organizations, as our festivals, we need to also reflect that as well.
Thanks a lot. And the time is running here, but there should be time for a question from the live audience in Berlin. Any questions from Berlin?
Is this the mic? Yeah. Hi, I'd like to ask a question on behalf of the organization Gender Relations in New Music. The question is classical music Europe's folk music or its traditional music? And if yes, why isn't the Berlin Philharmonic and Opera Foundation here? Is this kind of cultural essentialism really what we want to stand for in Europe? And also, does focusing on these moments of meeting, quote unquote, of cultures not turn them into monoliths? Thank you.
Unfortunately, I can't really hear well.
I can repeat the question if you like, or I can put it in the chat.
Yeah, could you put it in the chat so I can read?
It should be on the chat on the YouTube too if you need.
Oh, I'm not.
From Monica?
Du Yun, I have the question here.
Is it just a connection issue? I can talk slower.
Oh, you have it's the Q&A. Is that what I'm looking at? Ah.
Yeah. So the question is classical music Europe's folk music or its traditional music? And if yes, I'm wondering why there's not the Berlin Philharmonic here and the Opera Foundation. And if this is a kind of cultural essentialism that we really want to stand for in Europe. And also, does focusing on these moments of meeting of cultures not turn them into monoliths, into essential sort of wholes that can't be mixed or don't already exist in a moment of mixture?
First of all, in many regions, there are differences between folk music and classical music.
That's why I'm asking about Europe specifically, or Germany specifically.
I don't think classical music is Europe's folk music. I think it's this is also how my training is. I don't think what I have learned is Europe's folk music, because I have also learned Europe's folk music. It's a very different practices. And the reason I bring up to all these topics is that my understanding is we're talking about diversity. We're talking about decolonizing of that contemporary music. And so I'm trying to link into my understanding of, or my perspective of the contemporary life that is more than just Germany. I do not know why isn't Berlin Philharmonic and Berlin Opera Foundation isn't here, but I think that with next round, maybe when we are talking more enough of those topics, maybe they do want to be on this kind of panels, especially when they when the orchestras now really are trying to find their inventive way to re-engage their audience, especially during COVID time. Is this kind of cultural essentialism really what we want to stand for Europe? I don't really understand what is cultural essentialism means.
So I think, Du Yun, thank you very much. The time is running here, so I think we should stop here as we need to go on. But thank you very much, Du Yun, for this keynote, multifaceted curation, and also for a very interesting conversation in this Q&A session. And thanks for being with New York.
Yeah.
Now we will have a 15-minute break. For the live audience in Berlin, it's a coffee break. And for our online participants, you can also now listen to music online presented by the artist Cedric. And at 1 o'clock, we will continue with our first panel with the title, The Emancipation of Curation. And thanks for being with us, and see you soon.